Um, yeah, so I'm glad I'm here. I was rushing around here, so I might just take a little while before I get into like talking mode. Um, but I'm going to talk about substance drug checking. So drug checking is a harm reduction response in the program that I helped develop with my collaborator in chemistry, and as a response to the overdose crisis. And so before I begin, just do a territorial acknowledgement. Our project is mainly throughout the island and the indigenous territories in the island, and but I'll describe some of the other parts that we work on. Um, Most of us that work on the project do not identify as indigenous, and we try to do different ways around decolonizing drug checking and working with indigenous groups such as Kwam in town. Um, One of the ways that we are trying to do some of this work is we've created it's not yet ready to go out, it's just being formatted, but creating an Indigenous harm reduction approach to drug checking as a handbook that one of our Masters in Indigenous Specialization students has been working on. And looking at basically how, just like a lot of harm reduction comes from medical models and isn't very based in Indigenous ways and teachings. We realize that drug checking has added layers of research and technologies and other ways that might be alienating to Indigenous folks from accessing the service. And so we're looking at how we do exchanges, how we do more relational work, how we exchange medicines with the substances, the drugs that we receive, and just the role of spirits in machines and the roles of spirits in spectra. So we're doing quite a bit of trying. Sorry, I hit my microphone there. So we're trying to do some of that work, is some of the ways, but overall, just really recognizing the role that prohibition and drug laws have played in colonization. I also want to recognize that most of us have been impacted by the overdose crisis, now going into its ninth year. And recognize those who we've lost, how we've been impacted, our friends and family have been impacted, how our university has been impacted too, and just always want to hold people close. I have one slide, well, the next slide, that is numbers, but I typically often try not to put any numbers on slides that reflect the overdose crisis that happened. So these are the numbers. This is why all of a sudden there's interest from government in drug checking. The crisis was declared in April 16th, 2016, when there was almost 1,000 overdose deaths that year. And it just was this massive increase from the previous 2 decades, really. And so at this point now, like, we know that there's a lot of media stories around possibly overdose rates dropping, especially in the States and a bit in Eastern Canada. And I was looking at this slide again, because I don't often present it, but I wanted to present it because I just was sort of realizing, like, if there is like an 18% drop in overdose, as we're hearing, rates, overdose fatalities, like, we're looking at, this was an emergency level, was like 40% of where we're at now was called an emergency. Like, to go back down, like, it's going to be so significant before I think we could declare that the emergency is over. But why it's important is that we did declare an emergency. And I think British Columbia is the only jurisdiction that has declared toxic drug deaths to be a crisis, a public health crisis. And why I wanted to point to that is because it's there's a lot of enabling legislations in a public health emergency. Most of us know the ministerial order that was passed in December 2016, which allowed overdose prevention sites to be set up almost overnight, compared to like 10 years of trying to do Section 56 applications to the federal government. We could just start setting them up quite easily. And now I can get sanctions to do drug checking just about anywhere from our medical health officer, like, within 2 days. So all of that is around the fact that we have this enabling legislation by using a public health emergency to be able to do things that most jurisdictions in Canada and the United States don't have. But a bit of my background is in harm reduction. My bachelor's is in sociology, and then I went into social work. And And my harm reduction, because I'm older, my harm reduction started with HIV, early HIV days, and then went to homelessness as it became more of a crisis through the 90s. Um, and I think it's important to note, like, not just how harm reduction has moved from HIV to toxic drug crises in many ways, especially in British Columbia, but to recognize that we're in different co-occurring crises. And again, we know that COVID, and there was two public health emergencies for years in British Columbia, the toxic drug emergency and the COVID emergency. But for many of us, we also see it coming in the context of homelessness and dire poverty. So it didn't come out in 2015, 2016 when overdose came up. It was already a crisis of people dying on the streets. And we were calling it street deaths at the time. It wasn't overdose deaths. And so overdose deaths were part of street deaths, but street deaths was more about just the structural inequities, the structural violence that was killing people who are unhoused or vulnerably housed. And we were trying to, at that point as activists, trying to raise awareness of the mounting deaths. And then at some point, it became aware that it was partly around the introduction of fentanyl in the community. It was also the context. The public health emergency isn't just, I don't want to just call it like a fentanyl crisis or an opioid crisis, because there was a lot of opportunities to do preventive work. And this is just like a few of the reports that were circulated, that were completed and ignored, basically, around developing supervised consumption sites, around access to a regulated drug supply, and much more, and drug checking. Decades of reports and people writing reports that no one ever acted on. And so it's in that sort of context, I think, that we now are in an overdose crisis. And I just always want to make sure that we know, like, because I talk a lot about drugs because we check drugs, but it is in this larger context, which I think is really important. And so when I do my work, it's not just as a service provider or as a researcher, it's as an activist. And I really don't separate advocacy and academia and activism. I think that you can't be I don't think we should have academics that are not activists. I think it's part of our responsibility as an academic to be an activist, because where else do you get tenure to be able to say whatever you want to say? So anyway, so we continue to do a lot of activism, and in Victoria, I don't think we would have supervised consumption sites, safer supply, drug checking. I don't think we'd have it without a lot of the activism that we've had, and the activism of the drug user movement, from Bandu to Solid to Nandu, and the drug war survivors of British Columbia. All those groups, I think, need to recognize, and then later Mom Stop the Harms as the losses happen. A lot of what the work that we were doing in the early days was trying to define the problem, raise awareness and define the problem, because people weren't seeing it as a problem. And it was, again, what are we problematizing was really important, because people were problematizing that people use drugs, not that the people couldn't access a regulated supply or have the knowledge of what's in the supply. So I'm going to do a little bit more context, and my hope is that I'm going to present some of the contextual parts, partly because it's a sociology class, so looking at the larger structures, and then I'm going to present the drug checking, and then try to bring it back to a little bit of like what I think could be some of the takeaways in theory and research. And I welcome questions as I go. So again, harm reduction is activist-based. I don't think that's new. I've seen some of the readings in your syllabus, and so needle distribution. I started part of my career included guerrilla needle exchange, and we were just buying. This isn't me, but this is the famous Dan Briggs in the States, which then turned into sanctioned needle exchange. Unsanctioned OPSs, like this one in Vancouver, to what sanctioned OPS here, like the Harbor. Compassion clubs are regulated supply. Started as activism compassion clubs and worked like the work of Dolph, which is here, to prescribe models. And drug checking too. So drug checking comes from the rave movement, the festival movement, psychedelics, but also from harm reductionists working in downtowns. And most of us, or everybody, I think that checks drugs in British Columbia, we owe so much to the work of Anchors and the work at Shambhala, where almost all of us trained. We call it our summer school. And there's usually 70 of us in the tent checking drugs through that festival. And we all learn so much from each other. So brief history of drug checking. Started with psychronauts and club kids, a lot of reagent testing in the day, and then started in the 90s, moving towards having more. I think this is probably the 90s because it's more related to internet, so starting to get Arrowwood, having more website-based things that people could send drugs, get things on results online, and then yeah, Arrowwood. You'll affect your search history if you look at it, but it's a drug checking site in the States that's unsanctioned or like underground drug checking site that's extremely useful, and they post all the results online. So a lot of people who are very much into MDMA and psychedelics and stuff can find a whole history of like you can even find old Quaalude testing on Arrowwood. It's quite fascinating if you're fascinated by drugs. And then we started getting into the changing of what we call opioids down in the down supply. And then at the end here is sort of where we are. We've been running substance for about 8 years, but when drug checking goes mainstream, and also we started bringing in new technologies, new spectrometers, the off-label use of urine analysis test strips, and then public health, like actually funded. So when we were all at Shambhala, everybody was wanting to go to Shambhala because nobody could check drugs usually in their community because it wasn't legal. And then all of a sudden now, like a lot of us are paid to check drugs. And so it's sort of, people now are like, they don't want to go volunteer because we get paid. Yeah, for sure. And that's because of Anchors from Nelson. And so and Chloe Sage is the person who started a lot of that. They were really early in getting the tent and having it all set up. And then the same crews now that do like Shambhala are also at Base Coast. We do Otherworld on the island. But again, a lot of the ways that we developed checking was from how Anchors decided to do it. And so Anchors was the aid service organization in the interior that, decided to do the festival at the time. Yeah. So why I think this is an important history is that I think we know like the institutionalization and the medicalization of harm reduction is a real risk. And I think that that's a risk in drug checking when people like me start getting significant amount of funding to do drug checking when what was a grassroots movement. And how do we keep the grassroots and how do we keep the activism in drug checking when it's all of a sudden a university-based, academically led project? Oops. And so that's what this is. So this is our project. I co-lead it with Dennis Hoare, who's in chemistry and computer science, and I'm in social work and public health. And it's that combination that I think makes our project really good. Like often drug checking can either be led by a chemist and be very lab-based and not really in community, or be really harm reduction led and social workers and nursing and stuff, and not have the spectrometers and the knowledge of how to actually like get some of the really trace level detection and quantification that we need in the supply. And so we've been running for 8 years. We're funded. It's an experiential learning project too. So almost everybody who works in there is a student or an alumni. We have a really great crew of people who check drugs all day, every day.
Where is that?
That's at North Park and Cook. Yeah, so that's our storefront. And that's another interesting thing. So we operate a storefront. There's not a lot of storefront drug checking around really. And we do festivals. So to get a little bit into the research, yeah.
How many storefronts are in Victoria?
Oh, none, just ours. Yeah, and so the only in Canada really there's just Get Your Drugs Tested from Dana Larson in Vancouver, and then ours. And those two sites check about 85% of all the drugs in British Columbia. So there's like about 100 points of contact for drug checking in British Columbia, and but 2 of them are really like doing almost all of the drug checks because a storefront's just so much more accessible than being in the back of an overdose prevention site or other sort of models. So yeah, I think it's really good and I think it's really welcoming. One of the challenges of a storefront is how do you make it work? So like when people talk about people use drugs, PWDs, like it's really like erasing like a lot of the complexities and a lot of the diversity of those of us who use drugs, and just like it doesn't have like, and so how do you invite everybody into the same door, into the same space? Somebody who might be totally street engaged, somebody who might be bringing cocaine for their wedding party, people bringing MDMA, young kids who might have what they think is real Xanax from Vic High, all of them have to be welcomed to the same space. And so that's where we try to bring in health equity perspectives and tailoring the service for different people. So to do that is I did implementation science research. So that's how I decided to start our project. Implementation science is sort of like action research, or it's like a form, I would say we use it as a form of community-based research or action research, where we actually are implementing a project and then researching it at the same time. So I don't have a lot of patience to just research a problem or count a problem and then publish that I counted how many people need drug checking. I'd rather sort of start it and then tie the evaluation to it. And so that's what we used implementation science for. And a lot of it is just sort of saying like, it's not about is drug checking needed or what's the benefits or the outcomes of drug checking, but how should drug checking be established to be effective? Because like we know, like if you see like the drug user groups setting up an overdose prevention site in a CCAN with no funding, compared to the Harbor, which has like $1 million ventilation and full staffing, you can see how you implement the same intervention can be very different and have different impacts on different people. So that's how we sort of started the project, is talking to people who would potentially use the service. One of the findings that we had also was that people wanted drug check. Like we were trying to figure out where do we locate drug checking, and people were like, they want it everywhere and for everyone. So we published that, but we also published how proportionate universalism is part of a equitable access to drug checking. So we want to be able to have a general population approach so that everybody who uses drugs or cares for people who use drugs could access it, but also have proportionate need, like have a higher reach to people who might face more barriers to access. So people who might be street entrenched, queer communities, Indigenous communities, young people who might be still at home. And so how we do some of that. And so we sort of created a thing, because the health equity perspectives that we bring to the project is we don't want to just set up a really, really good pilot project that UVic runs. We want a project that actually can function at a meaningful level to have meaningful impacts. So how do we actually do that, knowing that the crisis is affecting like everybody? So the third sort of paper that we pulled off of that was creating a social ecological model for drug checking. And because at this point, I think a lot of people and funders were saying that drug checking should be like behavioral. It should be like somebody who's going to use drugs brings you a drug, you tell them that it's really strong or it's not what they expect it to be, and then they would then decide to throw it away and not use the drug. I don't think that's super realistic. And it's also very abstinence-based, not harm reduction-based. So, but it was really based on this behavior or this individual change that was just in the middle. And that's definitely like the main function and the main visible action that we do, is to provide drug checking to individuals to improve their health and well-being and their safety. But we think it has a lot of other impacts that could be there and should be funded. So like, does it have impacts on the drug market? Could we have a control function in the market by having drug checking in a community? At the community level, could we have anti-stigmatizing ways to look at drugs, to be able to talk about drugs in different ways that's more open and address some of the community stigma and barriers? And then public policy. Could we be informing public policy by actually having knowledge of what's in the drug supplies? So our implementation goals from doing the initial research was to try to provide drug checking services to reach as many people in ways that work for them, to give people as information of what's in their samples as possible, and to find a balance between detailed composition, such as trace level detection below like 1%, with timeliness, access, and cost, and to offer drug checking reports and data to people who use drugs, public health service providers, and the general public, and to work directly with and in community. And so they seem really basic, but I think a lot of public health approaches to drug checking and harm reduction sort of don't explicitly try to keep all these things in place. I think there's like trying to like find some of these balances is sometimes really hard. Like we could provide some people with like really detailed drug checking responses, but then how do we actually provide drug checking to people in Port Hardy at the same time as in Victoria? And so like our project, like how do we make sure that like it's not just like you're getting really detailed responses, but you're actually getting responses really fast and to people through a large geographical area.
So Bruce, do people mail you samples?
So yeah, I'll go through all the different ways. Yeah. So the main way that people access this is just by walking in the store or a storefront. And that's the easiest way. But we don't want to just say that the only way that you're going to get your drugs tested is if you can physically like be in this geographical area and walk through that door and not feel like it's a scary place to be and access that. So we try to develop other models, but I'll just describe this one first. So we walk in the door there 5 days a week. It's got staff, mostly students, running samples of harm reduction and technicians. It's free and confidential. The results can be offered in 20 minutes. We usually have a backlog, so it's usually a bit longer. And we use different instruments, test strips, and portable spectrometers and a mass spectrometer. I'll just go through some of those instruments. So yeah, we use fentanyl test strips, benzo strips. This is our infrared spectrometer that we use the most. We try to mess around with the Raman, but we don't use it too much. And then the thing that we're pretty unique on is that in a collaboration with Vancouver Island Universities, we actually have a mass spectrometer right in there. And that our building is owned by Solid Outreach, the drug user group. They're our landlords. And so like it's pretty, this is like a lab. This is like supposed to be, universities and hospitals. Oh, now I'm just going all over the place here. Sorry, pushing the wrong button here. So yeah, so we have a mass spectrometer that's like right in the storefront, and it's really hard to do. So we're not sure if it's still feasible. We've been doing it now for about 3 years. So I think we've demonstrated that you can actually have a mass spectrometer in a storefront setting in a drug user group or drug user movement. But it's pretty hard because it captures like all the pollution in the air and every car that goes by and everything that we bring into the setting. But it means that we can give trace level quantification results to people, which is pretty essential in this crisis. So we do outreach. We do outreach on, this is some of us on 900 block, or we do outreach to different sites, setting up our places. We do work with Quamquam. We do work with Solid, going to all the supportive housing units. And then we can just collect samples and bring them back and get the results to people. We do sample drop-off and mail-in. It's not legal to mail drugs in Canada, but people can mail drugs, and then we'll open the envelopes. So we get a lot of mail drugs through this slot. So we just put it there so people can either address them and send them to them. We go on our website. We have a whole downloadable section so that people can just download the intake forms, the consent, the limitations, fill it in, put their drug in a little baggie, and send it off to us, hopefully in a bubble instead of a letter envelope, in a bubble pack, which helps us get through the sorting machines better. And then we got the distributed model. So as I sort of hinted, we want to check drugs all around the island. So all these spots are the island where we're at. So Port Hardy, Courtenay, Port Alberni, Duncan, Campbell River, and in Victoria. And so what we realize is that we don't need to actually have drugs to check drugs. What we need is the spectra from the drugs. So we developed this model, Dennis and I, and students on our project, where basically we take a spectrometer, and then we had somebody who did adult education and wrote a program so that people like me, like who do frontline social work, working in an overdose prevention site or working in a housing, and don't know how to read spectra or know chemistry or operating a spectrometer, we can basically just go through, load a sample on the portable spectrometer, and then just push send. And then the spectra would come through our database to our storefront in Victoria. And that person, that technician there, can sit there and actually check drugs for all of the island sitting in the desk there, because we could just look at the spectra back and forth. And then the person with relationships in that community, like in Port Hardy, they can just wait, and then they'll get the ding back on their computer, and the result will be there, and they have relationships with the person, and then they can convey the harm reduction information to that person in that community. So that's what we do through the island, is basically this way that spectra are not illegal to move, and we can also move them within a second between all these different sites. So we could be doing drug checking like for any country or province anywhere by just moving spectra around. It is limited to an infrared spectrometer, so not a mass spectrometer, which actually requires the drug also to be here, and more technical expertise. So that means it's a little bit limited. We can't see under 5%, which might be fine for like cocaine and MDMA and ketamines and such, which don't usually have like a lot of low-level actives. But for opioids, a lot of the things that are linked to overdose, like xylazines or carfentanyls or some of the benzodiazepines that are in the opioids, they're below 5%. And so that's why we always want to get the drug sent to us still and give a secondary result that uses a mass spectrometer. So we've been developing this whole project on how we can get these remote technicians and get the drug sent all around. And so every time somebody gets their drug checked, they get the randomized 9-digit code or a QR code. And that's just how we sort of connect all the results to people. So we just write the code on a business card, or people take a picture of the QR code, and then they can just go on our website, substance.uvic.ca. There's a results tab, put your number in, and then you can get your result. So again, like if somebody sent the drugs from Port Hardy or Port Alberni, they can just wait knowing that it's going to be checked in the next couple of days, and then go back online and get the result. They don't have to be living in that place where they actually have to walk through that door to get service. And so that's our website. You just put the code in. It's a pretty basic page. And then you get your result. So we're researchers, so we publish that. So we wanted to publish that this is like a model that actually can start getting significant scale and reach of drug checking, rather than being confined to like small physical spaces. And then we did the training, we evaluated the training program to see how feasible is it for people like social workers and nurses to be able to do drug checking.
Yeah. I was going to say, so does that mean you can go on the site and put any number in? Like randomly put in a number?
Yeah. You mean and get someone else's result? Yeah, you could play with it. So we used to do that whole model. Again, some of these things are sort of pretty grassroots. Like when COVID happened and we got locked out of all of our spaces, and we were doing drug checking in the encampments and stuff and in the hotels, I came up with like raffle tickets. And so we would give one person a raffle ticket, and we'd pin it to their thing, and we'd keep a raffle ticket. And then when they'd come in from wherever, they just bring the raffle ticket, and that was their number. So that's how we developed the whole QR code and everything. And but what we realized is that the numbers were sequential. So if you had a number and then you knew the person in front or behind, you wanted to know what their dope was, you would just have to go up one or down one number. So that's where we came with the randomized 9-digit codes to do that. So we basically now have reduced drug checking training to about 7 hours for people to be able to load a sample, send a sample, do the strip test, talk about the results to people, and try to get the stuff back to us.
It only takes 7 hours
to train somebody. Yeah. And then we wanted to get drugs sent to us legally, because Canada Post, again, doesn't like us using their system to mail drugs. So we worked with Purelator Canada, and they were really keen. They're like, that's our bread and butter, is sending things that people don't want. So we use this medical express envelope. So it's the same thing that people would send, I don't know, DNA samples or blood samples and things like that. So we used that, and they had all the protocols to how to send biohazard materials. And then we went through the whole criminal stuff on how you send restricted or prohibited materials. And we developed this way now that we can legally courier drugs. And so the legal part means that then we can get public health to fund it, because public health doesn't like to fund illegal activities. So by having a sanctioned way, then all of a sudden we can say to our funders, like, we want you to be able to provide for this. And so basically this is this is a pretty silly side, but you give your sample to Piot, and then like we can just put everything in the Purelator envelope. This can be in Kelowna or in Cranbrook. And then you can access this one mass spectrometer. It's the only mass spectrometer in all of BC that's checking drugs. And then you can still in Cranbrook or Kelowna go online and get your result. You don't have to live in Victoria to access that one instrument. And so using that model, we're checking drugs for, this is like all of our outreach. These are all of our island sites. And then we're doing drug checking for like all these interior places and Fraser and North and Coastal. And so we're checking drugs for the whole province using that Purelator envelope, where every week these drug checking sites will all do point of care with an infrared spectrometer, and they can talk with people, but then they're sending samples every week to us for confirmatory checking. And on the island here, this is how many drugs we've been checking every year on the island. So it used to be like 900, and now it's 9,000 on the island that we're checking every year. So it's been a significant increase.
Yeah. So in the more remote areas, you check first with the infrared.
Yeah.
And then you then also take a sample and mail it in. So
yeah.
It's kind of like double stage.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point of care drug checking with the infrared can tell people like most things that you'd want to know, but it's the trace level and the quantification. So with fentanyl, like people right now, there's quite a large variability of fentanyl concentrations. And so some of like what makes the supply toxic is that even if somebody knows it's fentanyl, they might not know if it's 10% fentanyl or if it's like 30% fentanyl. And so how the dosage then is just really quite different. So that requires the mass spectrometer more than the infrared. So we try to give as much information that the technology allows. And then we continue to try to develop the technology. So again, Dennis on our project is not just a chemist, he's in computer science. So he wrote his own software so we've developed our own, part of also like we sort of try to avoid the big corporations that make money off of people use drugs. And so instead of buying software, we just wrote our own, or I didn't write it, but our project did. And so we call it LEAP, for Let's Empower All People to Use Spectroscopy. Basically what it is machine learning. So when we put in this is what it would look like if you were checking a drug. This is the spectra, and each peak would have a different drug. And you have to know like at which wave number or wavelength those things are. So like which one's fentanyl and which one might be just basically caffeine and a filler agent. But what we use is machine learning. And so we have all these drug data libraries, and then we do a matching. And so we can do a match and see from the 10,000 drugs that we've tested with the mass spectrometer, or sorry, 30,000 drugs now that we've used the mass spectrometer on. We match those spectra, and then we can sort of tell somebody a confidence level, like at 98% confidence, that is a fentanyl sample at 10% fentanyl with a base of caffeine and 3% bromozolam. Because we've seen that spectra, we lay it on top and match it. So it's as similar as like a Bird app or Shazam for music app, or what's another one? Plant identification app. Same sort of technology. You just point it and it can tell you a confidence level. That's a rose, and so we're using that for drug checking, and we think this will again get more people like us to be able to get through that technological barriers and the cost of training people. And so it's basically that, and part of it also is that we wanted software that's only for harm reduction, only for checking drugs, because almost all these instruments and everything, they're developed for border control and for enforcement, and then we use them for harm reduction, and the software has it, like they're called drugs of abuse and all these sort of words on them. So we wanted to develop something that was just harm reduction only, because the person who uses, when enforcement and border control use a spectrometer, like that Raman wand, like if they pull out your laptop when you're going through security and they're looking at it for bomb stuff or drugs, is just to detect a yes or no. And then if it's a yes, you're arrested. And if it's a no, you're fine. With people who use drugs in harm reduction, they want to know what it is, the whole thing. They want to know if it's a mannitol based or caffeine based. They want to know if there's a tranquilizer in there also. So you're giving much more complex information. So our software is geared totally to be able to tell the full product to the person who wants that opportunity. So again, trying to get autonomy from commercial software companies. Because they basically, you sell a spectrometer by the software, and you can't get the software without buying the spectrometer. They're sort of tied, sort of like Microsoft sort of stuff, and try to break away through that. And so we're going to be giving this away. It's not going to be open access as much as shared access. And so we're going to create it and try to create a shared database so that drug checking projects, like right now we're working with New Mexico and California, and we'll try to get them to put all their spectra in, so that when we're checking drugs, whether it's in Toronto or Vancouver or California, we can all compare our results to that growing spectra database, and then do all the learning. Because like we don't have a lot of black tar heroin up here, or we don't have the same xylazine that's out East Coast and everything like that. So our goal is to basically automate without replacing people. And so it's a fine line, just like AI has its pros and cons. This use of AI or machine learning also has those pros and cons, and we're really trying to keep our awareness that we think that we can get more automated results is going to have a lot of benefits for harm reduction and public health, but we still need that people are going to talk to each other, and that the harm reduction will be that the advice and the interpretation and the relationship stuff is still there. And I think it's a really tricky balance, because also a lot of people might prefer to not have a human-to-human contact because of the stigmatization of using drugs. And so sometimes interacting with the machine, just like the way people put shit online, but they wouldn't say face-to-face, the machine might have a better relationship to be able to talk about drugs than a face-to-face person too. So yeah, so we're wading into that, and trying to figure it out as we go. So just to conclude again, I think it's around how do we not just do drug checking, but how do we do drug checking that has scale and reach? And I think as part of our drug policy and harm reduction, I think we've really neglected that. I think like the fact that Insight was the only supervised injection place for about 17 years in North America shows the real risk of doing pilot projects and research projects. And that I think that if we are going to do a pilot project or a research project, we really need to keep this awareness of how do we actually have scale and reach, because otherwise we just have these really highly funded projects that are not going to have any meaningful impacts. So it's something that I'm sort of passionate about, and I think we just it's hard to do both, because like we want to provide really quality service, but to provide quality service to all kinds of communities all at once is really hard to do. So I wanted to end with a bit of theory, because we're on university. It's a bit of a critique around evidence-based. So harm reductionists like to say they're evidence-based, and I think we are to a degree. But, there's a lot of like slinging around what's evidence. So like Alberta, thinks involuntary treatment is evidence-based. And then some of us will say involuntary treatment has no evidence base. So I don't like the word evidence-based interventions. And drug checking is not an evidence-based intervention, especially as an overdose response. Like we don't have the evidence. We don't know if providing drug checking actually reduces overdose rates, or for an individual or for a population. I believe that it does not increase overdose. And I think that it's a rights issue, and people have a right to knowledge, and a right to that information, just like we would if we're going to buy some of that spinach in a tub that we know is at risk for E. coli. We have a right to also know that there's risk with drugs, and that we're going to be able to access that information. And people who love people who use drugs can access that on behalf of other people. But I have a problem with thinking it's evidence-based. And falling into that real positivist language of evidence-based too. And we're often forced into having to argue for that. So then Kerry Lancaster and Tim Rhodes, these who are pretty big harm reduction names from Australia and I think UK maybe, came up with evidence-based, not evidence-based, but evidence-making. And this really clicked for me. And so what their critique of why they don't like evidence-based is that the evidence is usually outside of the complexities of practice and policy. So that's like randomized controlled trials. Like when you take somebody totally out of their like being unhoused, or like somebody on HEP treatment who's still actively using drugs, or you take out everybody. Like I was in this thing last week and they were like, they did this like research, but they removed every drug that had a benzo out of the down because it wasn't matching their model. Like that's evidence-based, but it lacks the complexity of like real life. So that's one thing. Some evidence and knowledge is more valued than others. And this is again where we're trying to work with people who use drugs to make sure that people are not replacing their bodily knowledge with a technology, with a spectrometer knowledge, but to use the spectrometer with your bodily knowledge, and you use the knowledge of who your seller is, and you trust your dealer as much as you want to trust your dealer, because that's a really good knowledge base that you have also. So how do you value these different knowledges? Evidence is pre-existing as fixed or stable and ready to be translated. Yeah, so like evidence in one place, again, like evidence is not going to maybe work in other places. So evidence in a downtown, inner city, and this is what always bugs me about downtown east side research, is like BCCSU would do all this research in the downtown east side and say this is then a fact, and none of us have a downtown east side. It's such a unique context and such a unique population. And that's not to say it's not valid research. It's great. There's tons of great research, but it's not fixed. Evidence is not fixed. It's very different in different situation. And then who is excluded or silenced? Again, that's where you start bringing in decolonization and the stigma around people who use drugs. Is participation limited or responses and policies limited? And how do we make evidence through interventions? And so it's that last question that goes to evidence making. And so I'm just going to read it. We have accordingly described research processes as an implementing science, a science which is performed as an intervention, a science which participates in the relational materiality of implementing and evidencing, a science that makes interventions that matter. And so for me, like that's they're really academic. Like they write in ways that I don't write. But to me, that's really inspiring in that we don't need to be confined by what's evidence-based. Like we can make the evidence, and we can do it with rigor. It's not like we can just make shit up. Like we have to have rigor. We have to have studies that are trustworthy, but we can actually not as researchers just again, like count problems and document problems. We can actually do the interventions that matter. And so to me, like when I started reading their work, I was just really inspiring. And then to go back to the beginning around the role of activism in academia, I think like where we really have some hope is when we link action and research in the movement, drug user movement. And I think we've seen that so many times. And after dissing the downtown east side research, like that's how Insight happened. It was from like Thomas Kerr going in there and others, and Evan Woods going and working with Van Du and putting down all of the grace. And then when the conservative government tried to shut down Insight, they were able to point to like the 70 peer-reviewed papers that came out of the downtown east side to squash that challenge. So there is this role of when we start working with movements and having research within evidence-based movements and doing evidence making in movements, I think there's just like a real potential there for those of us to start blurring those boundaries about who's in community, who's doing research, what's evidence-based and what's evidence-making and things like that. And that's what I'm learning about drug checking. So this is all of our contact information. And that's our website. And our Instagram is most active. I think we might be off of Twitter by now and off of Facebook maybe. Well, we don't have it in here, but you can also sign up for our weekly reports through MailChimp if you go to our website, if you want to see what's in the drug supply every week. It's also on our Instagram every week too, and then our monthly reports too. Yeah, so that's what we're doing, and I welcome questions. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Um, so when we started, we thought we would just use the infrared spectrometer because it's cheap and it's portable, and we were going between different sites. Um, and it was Solid Drug User Movement, Society, who's like, no, we want mass spectrometry and we need trace level and quantification. Like this is not good enough, and the sellers want this information. And the Solid works really well with sellers, so they were really demanding customers, collaborators, and so they really pushed us to bring the mass spectrometry into their building, and that's been really hard. But that is probably like most of our innovations have been because Solid pushes us to provide it, because like I think we could provide a good enough service. Like everywhere else in North America is using infrared and they don't use mass spectrometry except Toronto and Victoria. And so it's a good enough model, but I think the drug user group here was pretty demanding and really pushed us to be able to get that for every sample. So it's also that we try to run every single sample on mass spec, not just like the hard ones. Nobody wants to pay us to do that, though. That's the problem. So we don't know how long we can keep it up, but right now I think the public health would rather pay for more basic service. They don't like, they think it's a bit of a too much to do. So I think,
How much does it cost?
well, to run a sample, just the disposables on a mass spectrometer plus the strip test and everything is only about $10. It's more just the people time, the staff time. It takes a chunk of time to run samples through both instruments. And then the other part is outreach. And so I think we, again, trying, how do we actually go out, and that was part of also getting sanctioning, which was to be able to carry drugs around. So originally they didn't like us carrying drugs in our backpacks. They wanted us to be in cars, but most of us are on bikes and buses and stuff. And so we can just do a chain of custody form now and go to like the different housing projects, the shelters, get drugs, and then report back the findings. And we work with Solid on that in Quam with Indigenous Harm Reduction team, and try to, as much as possible, work with them. So I think those are the things that I think we learned the most, is just people pushing us to do more than we were going to just settle into. Is there another question? Yeah.
I was wondering if, like, the majority of people who come in get drugs tested, if they're selling,
Yeah.
or would that be like, because you want it to be like a low barrier base? Would that be like any inquiry? Would that kind of increase barriers?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I love talking about drug checking for sellers. And we have a grad student in Dimensions of Health. He's publishing a paper right now on drug checking, with all of our data on drug checking for sellers, Pablo. And so we do ask. We ask who are you drug checking for, and why are you getting the drug tested? And so first fun fact is over a third of people are not just checking for themselves; they're checking for others. So drug checking isn't active caring often. It also can be used the other way. It can be parents who've gone through their kid's backpack and bringing something. You can't get a drug checked at our place without consent of the person. But yeah, people selling, and it's a pretty high number. Like it's about, I think, 20% to 25%, and it's more of the people with opioids than otherwise. So that's how many are saying it to us. And just like the drug market, runners often bring, just like runners will sell drugs for sellers, runners will bring samples for us. Sometimes it's really obvious because there'll be like 4 downs, 1 MDMA and 1 cocaine and 1 ketamine. It's just like you're just checking your whole supply that you brought back from Vancouver. So so that's also, and they're not supposed to say they're checking it for selling usually. So but yeah, I call it an upstream action, like in social dimensions of health. Like drug checking for sellers is upstream. We're basically then drug checking for 100 people instead of 1. We get producers selling, so they'll bring in raw fent and want to make sure it's raw fent and no cuts and buffs, and then they'll go cut it, and then they'll like make sure. And some of us, like social workers, we're bad at math, some producers are bad at math, and so sometimes they don't cut it to the level they want, and so like it's really great when like, yeah, that's still way too high. Go add some more caffeine to that, and so they'll do all that mixing. Um, we published an interesting paper on heterogeneity in samples and basically trying to get harm reduction to help people better mix their supply and reduce cross-contamination. So like that harm reduction is not there. People do not want to help people make drugs. But like if we could actually make safer, more regulated processes for making drugs, we would have a much better supply. So like mixing, like using like a magic bullet to mix drugs and then using the same one that was used for fentanyl for cocaine and stuff, like, because just to, like fentanyl like has to have a big base because it's so concentrated. So fentanyl isn't like cocaine or MDMA. Like it should be less than 10%, and then 90% of it has to be something else. So you could get these hot spots, and you can also just get really wild concentrations. So here in Victoria, it's usually just caffeine that you can buy at Best Barn or Bulk Barn, or at Popeyes and stuff, and just like you just fill it, and then you mix it to concentration levels. And so a good seller would know what people want, what level it's wanted, and then typically it's added something because it's fast acting. People will add either a benzo or a tranquilizer to extend the opioids with it. Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're going to try to get drug checking on campus. So we're trying to move a proposal through there, and that'll be student run. But yeah, we're not very good at taking volunteers. We do a lot of experiential learning opportunities. So we do practicums and co-ops and grad student, like in masters and PhDs, and other sort of people can get other sort of pots of money to come and do work with us. I do directed studies, things like that. So we offer like a ton of those. That's like what we really try to do. And we're actually at CSER, where I work, the institute that I'm at. We're going to try to create like a experiential learning hub for people wanting to do substance use research for students to be able to provide more supports, because right behind you is one of our students. So I'm just very aware. So we don't offer a lot of support for students. And so wanting to get like more supports for them, and also so that we aren't a draining community. Like we don't want to throw people into like solid and then piss off our landlords. So yes, we're not very good at volunteers, but we do have a lot of other opportunities, and people send us resumes all the time. And we also have we do have like public health, social work, chemistry, computer science, dimensions of health. Yeah, we've had some sociology and psychology a bit too. So yeah, we actually have a lot of different, and that's what makes it pretty neat. Yeah, and we do festivals too. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a sort of interesting history, because everybody's sort of saying like your UVic project, why don't you have any drug checking on campus? And so we were looking at it years ago when we were starting, and basically like it's harder to do drug checking on campus than it is anywhere else. um, like yeah, it's a pretty risk averse place. Um, and so, and just some of the logistics, like between facilities management, the unions, campus security, and then the relationship with the police, they were like really bogging it down. And so we just decided that it had the risk of us having higher levels of restrictions on our other sites if we did drug checking here. But since the death of Sydney's death, and UVic having to now do some responses and be under some scrutiny, UVic executives interested in it, and so we're putting a proposal that would be basically a full-time spectrometer here on site with samples going down to our Cook Street location, a drop box, at least one drop box somewhere else on campus for some people who want to just drop off samples or after hours. And then special events like a Thunderfest, Week of Welcome, and residents move-in days, and do drug checking there. So we're revising. We presented to Executive Council last December, and now we're revising the proposal. They want us to do it as a research project rather than a service, health service. So we're going to do it as a 3-year research project, we hope. Yeah, and we welcome advice on how to do it. So yeah, if we have time, like throw out advice on how we should do drug checking on campus. Yeah.
I'm just like kind of confused on what are those, like what's stopping people? Because when you're mentioning like evidence-based, me personally, I maybe don't know so much, but it's like what damage could drug checking do? Like I just can't imagine it would do bad. I think it would mostly only do good. So what are people's hesitations about it?
We're pretty pro-drug. So that's, I think, one of the big hesitations is that does it sanction people using illicit drugs? And that's definitely a UVic consideration. If you have drug checking in residence, does that mean you're allowing drugs to be used in residence? So that's a chunk of it. There's a little bit, like there's always a risk that you're missing something. You're providing inaccurate results, and somebody could face harms because of that. That's like just an inherent limitation of, riding your bike and driving a car type thing. Like, is that there's just limitations in doing things in life. And so drug checking is one of those, is that you can not see something. And so we go over that. Like our part, when we do drug checking, we'll say, we'll tell you everything we can see. Sometimes you might not see things. We'll tell you everything we know, but that's not going to be everything. You still always is risk when you use a drug. So those are some of like what we do. And we're all through research ethics too. So we have like ethics, we've got all kinds of controls on this. But yeah, that's the biggest thing, is an acceptance of drug use. Yeah.
Is UVic's resistance necessarily expressed as based in that, or does it seem like it also has to do with image? I find that often UVic resisting any kind of positive change, specifically something in drug testing on campus, they care about image to visiting campus, so we don't want to show like an association to that kind of thing. Do you find that, or not as much there?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, communications team is always there. Yeah, and even more so in the last year. And so we checked drugs for Dolph. You had Jeremy here, right? So like we were the drug checkers for Eris and Jeremy. They also used UBC's Hind Labs also. And so Eleanor Sturko, the conservative, BC United now conservative, like she totally went at us, and UVic for us checking drugs. We were in the legislature. I had weekly meetings with UVic executive comms, the lawyers, because of because of the politicization. So that's some of the risk of why people don't want universities doing it. But like again, like drug checking for Dolph, we're really super happy we were able to do that the day. Yeah. On campus, so UBCO in Kelowna used to, and the nurse that set that up, the nursing student who set it up, she's actually working for us now. They shut it down, and so she's doing her postdoc with us. But I think they're going to restart it. Hind Lab, which is just a chemistry lab at UBC, he was checking drugs. He's sort of stopped too. So there's been some just individual students sort of have started stuff, or individual professor. Our mass spectrometer is not, often we hear well, we have a mass spectrometer in our university or in our hospital, so we should use it to check drugs. It is years and years of method development to get a spectrometer to check drugs in the ways that we would actually get a result in 10 minutes to somebody. And just we use internal standards. So it's sort of like an alcohol shit mix. It's got every drug in there. And so we have targeted lists. And so, but we have to have that standard drug in there. So we buy a standard drug from a lab that says this is fentanyl, this is bromazolam, this is ketamine, and then we put it in there. And then that's how we do weight by weight quantification, is then we compare the spectra from the standards that have, I think, 40, 50 different drugs, maybe more. and then maybe it's about 100 now. And then we compare it, and anything that's there, that's why we can do like it's actually like 17% bromazlam. Like we can do that comparison. But all of that took years. So so that's why sometimes when people say like we have a mass spectrometer at our university, why don't we check drugs? I'm just like, oh, like you really need to get in community and you really need to like develop it. But I think that's it. Uh, and again, most of it is infrared spectrometers, these little portable ones. And so like not, there's the only other mass spectrometry in Canada that is really active is Toronto. And they're through the hospital, like they're through St. Mike's and CAMH, I think. Yeah.
I guess I'm a little curious how that works. Like, use different types of drugs reflect different like wavelengths.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And then in the if it's a GCMS, a gas chromatographer, I can't say mass spectrometer, they go through the tube and the different weights, they go at different levels. And so you can, and then they sort of separates all the wavelengths. And so that's how they measure it through there. But yeah, I only know how other people describe it to me because, yeah. Yeah, but it's pretty cool. So, but I thought as a social worker that these spectrometers, for the amount of money you pay for them, that it would give you a printout and tell you like what your drug is. But it's just all these spectra, and then you have to like it's this art, like it's really like art. And we actually made some stickers that are like drug art with all the different spectra, and you have to like pull them apart, subtract like if you're looking for the fentanyl and it's like at around 3%, you have to take out all the caffeine to see it. Or if you're bringing in like a fake Xanax, there's all these bulking agents in it. So you got to take out all that starch and all the color and everything, all the things that made it a pill to find if it's going to have alprazolam in it. So like all of that takes a lot of work, and that's like what technicians are people who like to look very deep into something. That makes a great drug checker. Yeah.
Could you tell us more about your relationship with the police?
Yeah.
Police monitor you. Are they worried about producers coming to you for checking?
Yeah. So we don't have any relationship with police. That's I don't want to have to ask permission to check drugs. So the drug user group does have a relationship with police, and they have agreements. And so we haven't typically had to like enforce that we're a no police zone. Um, so it's been
Police don't come to this one.
no, like they may be around, and because there's some street activity around our building often, and so they might come around, but they don't try to come in, and they they don't try to bring us samples either. So we've there's sometimes like we can do faster drug checks than police can, and so we've had some pressure in RCMP communities that we work with police because sometimes RCMP have different relationships, and I really always respect and like it's a bit of a privileged position in urban areas to say we won't work with police because in some other areas like you don't really have a choice, um, and so um, and so if sometimes police are the only way that you can actually transport samples or actually get things done. So um, there's been like police in like Campbell River saying like, why can't we check things? Because like we want to help people, you know. So my I have a very blunt view that as long as you're incarcerating people for drug use, then we can't trust you.
But what if they're investigating something and they want to know whether someone used your service or somehow want to pull you into some
Yeah,
type of examination?
yeah. So I talk with my research ethics, and they say that they will protect us against this, any subpoenas of our information, and they did that with Dolph, which is going to court. So anybody who like somebody's individual cell phone might be subpoenaed, but um, I've been told that we would none of our data, none of our protocols would ever go out of our door. Yeah, yeah. No, like to us. Yeah, Yeah, I think we're always a little bit like wondering like what does it look like when our results go back and like people are sold crap and then they tell their seller like you sold me crap and like and then that goes up and stuff like so there's a real risk in some of that maybe but it's something that we're gonna that's just sort of a reality of it. So like we sort of encourage people to just like sellers to check the drugs if they want to do it, and people will use it. Like sellers will use the fact that they check their drugs as a method of selling. Um, so we've been okay for that, and then just basically neighborhood upset neighbors is all we get, and so we're in the North Park neighborhood, so pretty much every month we go to the North Park Neighborhood Association meetings, and they're really great, and they support us being in community. And so if a neighbor complains, we do naloxone trainings for the neighborhood association. We do clothing drives together, and like we just try to be part of Good Neighbor. Our windows we always paint, and we try to paint them to make it look like really. Again, it's a bit of an anti-stigma thing that we have a storefront that people walk in, and the business is for drugs, and but so we paint all these different. We have rotating artists in residence who will paint our windows and make it sort of look good. Our building has a lot of different services. So the Safer Prescribing program is next door, and a cannabis substitution program around the corner. And so but we're the only name on the building. So neighbors complain, it's always us that get the complaint because substance is the only visible name on the whole building. But it's often not people accessing drug checking that they're concerned about. But yeah, like people are also just concerned that they have people like we'll get neighbors often coming in saying I just like this is like what do I do? Like there's people like on the nod in my front yard. Like and I don't want to bother them. I want to be respectful, but I also don't know like to do stuff. And so we get a lot of that, and like we have it's again people will talk to us and we'll talk about like have you ever tried to like just hand water to somebody, like instead of saying like are you okay, like just say like would you like a water, like that's a good way to rouse somebody who might be on the nod and you're not sure if they're overdosing or not. And so and then just again offering training on naloxone, which they often appreciate. So we try to approach it that way, and just try to be good neighbors, which is a mix. And some people are just never going to want it there. And like I don't want a fire hall beside my house, but I want to have a fire department in my city. So like I understand people not wanting it beside their house, like because I wouldn't want to live right beside a noisy fire hall. So it's a little bit extra than having a nicer cafe that sells vegan goodies to have a harm reduction place there. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
You guys partake in any like full meetings, like City Hall, like I know Victoria just up this morning, and granted the
Yeah.
25% increase or something crazy. And then I know I volunteered and have a friend who works at our place, and they store a lot of stuff for houseless people, and they had to like scrape to get the funding for that. Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah. More provincial and regional than the city. So Solid has to go do city stuff a lot because they have contracts in the 900 block Pandora. So, and then the Dowler place was, hugely contested when Solid bought the Dowler building, and the neighbors complained about that. So they've been totally into that. And we haven't had to do that. So provincially, we're on a fair bit. And again, like the whole Dolph thing really got us in the legislature in a bad way. But that's where most of our politics are, not with the city, thankfully. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah.
You said you have no evidence whether checking reduces harm. Are you interested in gathering evidence?
Yeah. So well, that's the challenge. It's an anonymous survey. So our anonymous service. So we don't know any demographics about people, and we can't do really much follow up. So we could definitely go and do some unique research and ask people like, can we follow up with you and get that? I think it's really, we need to do it like with our funding so contested. If it doesn't reduce overdose, people don't want to fund it, like because people are pitting harm reduction against treatment, and so we really need that evidence, and I haven't figured out how to do it yet. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we have an option of a follow-up survey, and so that asks some demographics, and it's just really low pickup, I think, and we keep trying to figure out how to make it more visible. Um, but and then again, people like just rate us really high, like just like you're great, everything is like so great, and so it's like, oh, it's not data, like it's not like rating a Uber, like, like we actually want data. So I got out of Uber on Friday. It's just like he wouldn't let us out of the car until he said, like, you give us a 5-star, you give us a 5-star. And I'm just like, yes, let us out of your car. So it sort of felt like that's what our survey looks like. It's just 5 stars. Yeah.
What are the hours?
Noon to 7.
Noon to 7.
Yeah.
And why did you pick those hours?
It's sort of a balance between wanting to be open late at night, but that none of us want to work late at night. So it's sort of that. I think if we do drug checking on campus, I'm thinking 3 to 11. Again, sort of like that hospital shift sort of time, and that we might be able to get people, because people don't usually want to work much later than that. So
do you get customers who want to come later?
I think we would, yeah. And so, yeah, but we also know, like, when we do festivals, like really active drug using festivals, like at raves, people typically check early. Like we often are shutting our tent like at 10 p.m. or so, like, because by that time, if some people have all checked out their stuff usually, or we're just doing ground scores after that. So it's not much happening. Like at Shambhala, they go till 4 a.m. because it's just a really big festival. But yeah, we'll often for smaller festivals, just like we think we got captured most people in the first 4 hours or so.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Please help me out. And you'll stay behind for a few minutes.
Oh yeah, and I have stickers if anybody likes stickers. Like you over there with all your stickers.
Yeah, questions, of course.